Today, I reach my final form as a 35-year-old dude with a beard by reviewing a Warhammer 40k book. Warhammer 40k is a sci-fi fantasy universe that has books, video games, tabletop games, but most famously, it has painted miniatures that you can partake in and paint yourself. This franchise has been around since the 80s, and it has been pretty niche for a lot of that time, but you have seen its DNA in some franchises like StarCraft, for example. Apparently, Blizzard tried to license Warhammer back in the day and weren't able to do it, and that's when they made the StarCraft game. But since then, Warhammer has exploded with over 400 books, dozens of video games, and I think it made a big resurgence during COVID because of the painting miniature hobby. It's just one of those things you can do indoors when there's a pandemic outside. So like Magic the Gathering, it was one of those things that just had a big boom about 3 or 4 years ago. And recently it's beginning to break into the mainstream a little bit, which is why I and probably a whole lot of you have become a little bit more interested in what's going on over here with Warhammer. So that's why I decided I was going to start reading some of the books, wanted to do a little review, let you know what I thought about it, and that's what we're doing today. So the book that I read was Dark Imperium. So one thing you have to know about the Warhammer 40k universe is that it is more of a setting than a timeline. The 40k stands for the year 40,000, so it's like in the far, far future, and it is fantasy. There's like, psychic people, basically space wizards, aliens, all that fun stuff. And from what I understand, a lot of the older books, they don't exactly have some canonical order where they're telling some story from start and finish. They're basically just taking that setting and then they just tell stories within that setting. Though I do think that's somewhat changing in more modern times. I think that Warhammer kind of wants its Lord of the Rings trilogy of the universe in the sense that they don't want to just have only world building, lore, and history. They want to have like a more central story, it seems like. At least they're attempting to. And they did that by going through what was known as the Horus Heresy, which is basically the story of the Emperor. When you hear people saying for the Emperor and all that type of stuff, that's what they're referring to as this Emperor. He's some god of humanity who's come up and become a figurehead for the human race. He has all of these sons who are the heads of the different Space Marine factions. And the Horus Heresy is basically just how some of those sons betrayed that emperor. And then obviously there's the handful of sons that didn't betray the emperor. So why this book, Dark Imperium, is somewhat important, the reason that I chose it is because Dark Imperium is about the leader of the Space Marine Ultramarines chapter. It's this dude right here on the front. So this guy, his name is Roboute Guilliman, and he is the primaris, the chapter leader of the Space Marines. Is it chapter leader? I think that's right. And for a while, he wasn't really in the story. He actually died. The first chapter of this goes through how he died. So this is kind of his story of him dying and then being brought back to life, being resurrected. But he died a long time ago, I think around the year 30K, and this book is his story being brought into the current modern setting of Warhammer in 40K. The year 40,000 and some change or something. So for the things that I liked about this book was Guilliman as a character. I think he's a pretty interesting, decent character. He was alive during the Horus Heresy, which means he was alive when the God Emperor was alive. It was his father. So he has a real relationship with him. Whereas 10,000 years into the future, now into the 40k universe, humanity looks back at the God Emperor as a god, as some supreme being, which that is never really super clear whether he is or isn't. That's kind of some of the mystery and fun tension of this whole universe, is the fact that some people are very religious and some people are very rational and pragmatic. And Roboute Guilliman, he falls in the latter. He's a little bit more pragmatic. He's a little bit more rational. He doesn't necessarily think the Emperor is a god. He doesn't look at himself as a god. But other people around him do look at him like that. So I do think that's a pretty interesting dynamic for a character. One of the biggest criticisms that I've heard of most of these 40k books is that all the Space Marines kind of seem like the same person. They're just stoic soldiers, and fair enough. I do think this book suffers with that, and I'll get to that in a minute. But I do think that Roboute's character is halfway decent. I think that he does have some depth to him, and he is somewhat more interesting than just the average Space Marine. So Roboute is trying to return humanity to its former glory. Over the last 10,000 years when he was out, things just haven't been going super well. I think there were 500 strong human planets back in the day, and he's trying to reunite those. Some of those planets I think are gone. Some of them are just kind of on their own, and they're not really part of the empires. So it's his goal to reunite all of humanity and bring it back to its former glory. But that also leads me to some of the things that I don't love about this book, and it's the fact that Roboute Guilliman's not even in half of the book. He's in about maybe a third of the chapters. This book is also setting up a 3-part trilogy, so there's a lot of world building and just kind of setting the stage, not just for that trilogy, but also, like I was mentioning, for the state of the universe in general. So you can tell there's a lot of outside influences that maybe informed some of the decisions that the author had to make, that sacrificed, telling a great story for just some world building stuff that doesn't give you the most focused story. And to be frank, it just gets kind of boring at times. And to be honest, I did have to push myself a bit to finish the book, which is just never a great sign. The book introduces a lot of characters. I remember being in chapter like 16, 17 towards the end of the book, and there was just brand new characters it was introducing. That's probably going to be fleshed out more if you continued reading the trilogy, but it did make for a bit of a scattered narrative. I also have to say I did not like the antagonists at all, really. So like I mentioned before, the book starts with Roboute Guilliman getting killed, getting mortally injured, and you'd think that that guy that killed him, that mortally injured him, you'd think that, hey, this is the bad guy, right? Because he did seem pretty cool. He was like, okay, this is the big baddie. This is the guy. He's going to come back. He's going to kick his ass. It's going to be sick. Wrong. It's some other guy. Some other guy's the bad guy. And that's what I mean, that this book maybe has some influences outside of the story that's influencing it. You would think if you start a book with some character killing one character and then the character's brought to life, he'd come back and he'd probably avenge that death, right? But no, that character, Fulgrim, who kills Roboute, he's not in the book at all after the first couple chapters. The real enemies of this book are the Death Guard. Now, the Death Guard is a Chaos Space Marine faction. They're green. They're basically zombie Space Marines, which, hey, it's kind of cool, right? Zombie Space Marines, that's pretty sick. But I failed to see any kind of depth to that faction at all. It seems like they're basically tempting Space Marines to just give up and die, and then you get immortality because you come back as a Space Marine zombie. Which, I mean, for me, that doesn't seem very tempting. Like, I didn't really find a lot of deep underlying psychological meaning behind any of that. They talk a lot about like rebirth and death and decay, and I just didn't find any depth there. Maybe there is in other books, but for this book, it didn't explore anything that made that faction and their point of view very interesting. They just were basically pure evil. They just wanted everything to just kind of die and decay. And like, don't get me wrong, that would be pretty sick. Like, if this was the plot for Space Marine 2 or Space Marine 3 and you had to fight these dudes, like, that'd be sick in a video game. But in a book, I feel like I do want to have a bit more like depth to like the meaning behind certain factions. I don't mean to just invoke Tolkien, but when you look at like things like the orcs or the elves, like there's like something psychological underneath that. The elves are like the rational mind that maybe is a little bit like less compassion. Orcs are like a force of nature that are pure evil and primal and whatnot. And I didn't really get any of that with the Death Guard faction. So it was hard for me to be invested and to really care that much about this faction. Just to give you another example, if you look at the Sith in Star Wars, like, you can understand why somebody would go down to the dark side. The power is tempting, to cut corners, to get unearned power. That's something that, humans do struggle with. I don't know that humans struggle with wanting to just die and become a zombie to be immortal. I don't know. Maybe you do. I don't know. Let me know in the comments. And there's not really any resolution with this faction as well. Like I said, it's a 3-part series, so I'm sure there will be a bit of a resolution. But the end of this book is a bit of a, sorry, Mario, she's actually in another castle kind of a situation. Now, that being said, the ending was cool. The fighting, like, there was some cool fighting action scenes. If this was a video game, I would totally play it. But that's not really why I read. When I read, I do want there to be something for me to think about. So having things just be action-packed, having some big boss fights in a book is not really going to carry me over the finish line. But from what I understand, this is a big problem that a lot of the Warhammer books seem to suffer from, but not all of them. From what I understand, there are some really high quality Warhammer books, and I do want to give those ones a shot. So I will be reading some more. I've found a few more in some used bookstores. I bought some online. The other books I bought have really high ratings, really good reviews. So I'm going to be getting into those. So if you're interested in what I think about those books when I read them, you can like, subscribe, all that fun stuff, because I will be making videos about those in the future. And I actually have already read the first story in the Eisenhorn Omnibus from Dan Abnett, and it seems pretty good. It seems a little bit different. It's from the perspective of an Inquisitor, and the story is just in his mind. You can hear his thoughts, and it's being told from just his one perspective. So it does seem like it's going to be more of a focused story about one character versus a lore-building kind of scattered narrative like Dark Imperium. But back to Dark Imperium, what would I give it for a rating? I would say I'd give it a 5 out of 10. It wasn't absolutely horrible, it wasn't unreadable. There's a part where Roboute Guilliman's talking to a clone of Krull, the leader of the Adeptus Mechanicus, and just like the scene and the setting, like, was really cool. Just dripping with style and just dark fantasy. There are some admittedly well-written, cool parts of this book, but I think as a narrative, it gets kind of boring. It's a little bit scattered. I'd probably recommend that you maybe read the Spark Notes, get a summary. You really don't need to read the whole thing to get the parts out of this book that set up the universe for where it's at. But like I said, if you want to stick around, I will be making some more videos about the other books I read, the ones that are pretty highly rated. Also, I just beat Space Marine 2. I usually play video games on this channel. If you haven't been here yet, I'm usually playing video games and talking about those. In the past 3 or 4 months, I've also been playing Bolt Gun, Rogue Trader, and I got a couple other Warhammer games that I want to get into. Oh, and if you want me to show you my Space Marine army, leave a comment, let me know. It's coming along. I'm pretty proud of myself. It doesn't all look amazing. I have made some mistakes, but it's been a lot of fun. So with that being said, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.